Okay, so welcome everyone. We're here to discuss the short book, The Menace of Fiscal QE by George Selgin. It follows we chose this book in part because our last book, Controlling Credit by Eric Monet, kind of had a lot of interesting ideas about the role of banks in kind of helping allocate credit in the economy, and the way that that may kind of have limitations, challenges, but also kind of opportunities, and kind of a lot of interesting history. And so this book follows kind of well from that, because it's a book that kind of takes an opposite position. I mean, not necessarily, because they're very different kinds of books, but I think this book is very much in a different kind of philosophical direction, on a similar question of how central banks may or may not be involved in kind of allocating credit in the economy, the extent to which this is good, bad, distortionary, helpful. And so, it's a short book. We read it all in one session, and I will just kind of give a super high level short recap, and then, we can kind of open it up to questions and stuff. But just kind of at the highest level, George Selgin makes an argument throughout the book that quantitative easing in general has kind of opened up interest in using central banks more actively to manage the economy. And his kind of perspective is that macroeconomic policy, or what he calls kind of macroeconomic policy, is really focused on kind of business cycle management, and that interest rates should be the main way that central banks do that, and only when they're at the zero lower bound might quantitative easing be something that is useful to do. But even then, and in general, its kind of use has potentially opened up the central bank to questions about why the central bank cannot use similar powers for other purposes besides business cycle management. And he goes a little bit into some of the kind of pros and cons. I mean, mostly the cons and challenges of why something like using quantitative easing for things that are typically more seen as kind of fiscal policy could be problematic, in the way that they may either distort the economy, the central bank may not be kind of well positioned to make those kinds of decisions. It may, I think a major theme throughout the book is what is kind of politically legitimate and what is not. And that there can also be all kinds of secondary side effects that could be troublesome also, ways in which it affects the interbank markets and this kind of thing. Finally, he mentions that the central bank's kind of operating framework may be kind of an important part of this. So when the Federal Reserve, for example, started quantitative easing, it switched to a floor system where the central bank creates many more reserves than banks really need. And in doing so, it maintains a much larger balance sheet. On the one hand, the central bank has done this in order to be able to continue to control interest rates, even when reserve balances are very high. But on the other hand, this kind of large central bank balance sheet, he argues, is something that becomes kind of politically tempting to, or opens up the central bank to potentially be a target for other political objectives. So that's kind of the most I'm going to say at the high level. There's a lot of very interesting kind of specific arguments and technical aspects of what's going on here, and we can kind of go through them a bit more one by one. But outside of a high level summary, and maybe stop and just see if immediately people had I don't know, initial thoughts, questions, parts of their kind of first impression that maybe I didn't get into the summary. What do y'all think?
Yeah, so I liked this book. I found that it was easier to read than the Eric Monet book, partly because I think it was the points that he was making were more straightforward. And Eric Monet was getting more into the complexity of, well, how do you do this credit policy, and how does a central bank manage, where credit should be allocated and that kind of thing. Whereas George Selgin is saying, no, just don't do that. Right. And it's interesting where he draws the line between fiscal policy and monetary policy, because it's not, when I think about fiscal policy and monetary policy, it's not, the line that I draw is not the line that George Selgin draws. And I think the 2x2 matrix that you mentioned last week, when is helpful in thinking about this, because George Selgin is saying that monetary policy is inherently macroeconomic. And if you're doing something microeconomic, if the central bank is doing something microeconomic and figuring out which things should get priority and how stuff should be allocated and that kind of stuff, then he's saying that's really a form of fiscal policy, that the central bank is sneaking in and doing fiscal policy there. But we can kind of take a step back and think about where the different things fall into the quadrants. So Eric Monet's credit allocation kind of falls into central bank microeconomic policy in a way, even though it has macroeconomic effects also. And then George Selgin's fiscal QE, that's that quadrant. That's the same quadrant that we're talking about. Something that's interesting that's missing maybe is the idea of macroeconomic fiscal policy, which is the opposite quadrant. Normally we think about, okay, fiscal stimulus, you can use fiscal policy to do macroeconomic things, and Selgin doesn't really get into that in this book. But hypothetically, I mean, if he's saying that fiscal policy is microeconomic and monetary policy is macroeconomic, then does that mean that fiscal stimulus is the fiscal authority really trying to do monetary policy or something like that? So those were kind of some of the things that I thought about. But yeah, curious to hear other people's initial thoughts.
Yeah, I guess in my mind, I thought about it less as necessarily the division. He's making less about macro and micro, but more around if it has some distributive allocative effect. And I think that the legitimacy of assuming that central bank policy does not or will not have a distributive allocative effect comes from like a specific way of thinking and understanding the world. And I think that as more and more as we have more fine-grained tools to understand the allocative effect of traditional monetary policy, I think those lines are going to start to blur more and more. So I think in some ways it's like a little bit, I thought the book was really interesting, thought it was fun, but I think that line of argument around his point around legitimacy, I think that's moot, because as we learn more about how economics work, that distinction is no longer going to make sense.
Well, I think it's true, of course, that any monetary policy is going to have some distributive allocative effect. That's certainly true, and he's kind of talking as if it doesn't. And I guess the way that I'm interpreting it is that there's kind of this default or natural way for the economy to operate, and the central bank's job or responsibility is just to kind of make sure that's happening smoothly. Yeah. And then we can maybe disagree with George Selgin about maybe whether there is a natural kind of way for the economy to work, or what that natural way is, that kind of stuff. I think there's something to be said for asking if there are certain aspects of macroeconomic policy that can be managed mechanically, and that we can all generally agree on kind of how that should go, and whether there should be a certain institution that's responsible for that kind of just automatic technical management, and then whether that institution should be the central bank, and whether you want to keep that separate from any kind of political decisions or anything like that.
Yeah, I would agree that that's like a legitimate debate, but I think that that's entirely separate around the demarcations around fiscal versus monetary, and whether or not, like, what's the political legitimacy of it? Because I think as we I think the understanding of there being certain of like a natural economy makes it so that it makes sense for there to be this institution that is outside of political control. However, if you cease to believe that there's any natural economy, that everything is political in nature, then that division and a central bank existing outside of a political body is something that becomes more contentious. It could still be the case that you decide, and certain, there's certain things that are mechanic, there are certain things where you accept it politically will still be set apart. But I think the way in which it's justified would need to change.
Yeah, I think I kind of like Alex's way of putting it, and I think for me it's a more I prefer kind of thinking about what kind of policies we think should have a certain amount of automaticity to them, automation to them. Whether that's like truly mechanical or it's, kind of bureaucratically insulated or whatever it may be. I mean, to Alex's kind of question about what is, what do we consider macro policy, et cetera. I mean, the way that I kind of think about it here is that, he seems to be coming from a bit more of like a, maybe not strictly a monetarist tradition, but something kind of in that direction. And I think often their perspective is that all macro policy should be managed like demand, like business cycle management is about demand management, and demand management should be done by the central bank, and therefore like all kind of macro policy is monetary policy. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that. And I think often the Keynesian tradition is kind of the opposite, where they say, well, demand management is kind of best done by fiscal for a variety of reasons. But I like the way that you put it, which is really just more kind of a question of, well, what tools is it useful to have on a certain amount of automation or institutional insulation. I think that a lot of Keynesians, for example, would be very interested in kind of more like fiscal automatic stabilizers, which in some way would be very, very similar. You could imagine checks being sent out every time unemployment goes above 5% or whatever. I think there's also this. I mean, and of course, I think the term macroeconomic is much larger than business cycle management. I mean, there's like growth economics and all kinds of other macro stuff besides business cycle management. But I think it's good to kind of understand his terms and perspective. I think that there's one of the very interesting questions kind of going through this book that's kind of a big theme is about kind of what is natural and legitimate and what is technical and what is not. And I think in many ways I share a lot of George Selgin's kind of broad perspectives about do we really want the central bank to be involved in everything under the sun, and is it kind of easily abused by opportunistic politicians and these kinds of things. And I have a lot of sympathy with that. I think that at a high level there's a lot that is kind of compelling to be said about it, or at least certain dimensions of it. On the other hand, I think that when I dig into some of the specific arguments that he kind of goes through here, I maybe get a little bit more reluctant, or I think that maybe this is not the best way to go about thinking about it. For example, when he's kind of talking about the kind of use of a corridor system in order to make the central bank's balance sheet seem a little less tempting. I mean, there's a sense in which it feels like it's manufacturing a certain kind of amount of technical cover, where the central bank says, oh well, it's out of our hands, we can't increase the balance sheet because we have this corridor system, when of course they don't have to have the corridor system. We know they don't have to have the corridor system. So there's, perhaps that's a useful political shield, but I think this goes into one of the kind of topics that we've talked about a lot is, what is kind of natural, what is kind of technical, the way in which certain political decisions end up being made to seem like they're technical questions when in fact, they may be very political. And that doesn't mean that the answer to a particular question needs to be yes or no, but it feels like, the answering it politically might be more compelling to me than, creating kind of a technical cover for it and saying, well, this is just how the finance and economics of the balance sheet work because we have this corridor system and what can you do? So yeah, I thought that was interesting because in the Monet book, for example, there's a lot of discussion about the way in which certain, policies that were kind of seen as political eventually were kind of replaced by technocrats and stuff. And there's a feeling of an effort to kind of do something similar here. And maybe that's useful, but I'm not sure that's the way that I would want to approach it.
Yeah, I think Selgin is making an important point, though, which is regardless of what you feel is natural or what kind of policy is neutral and what should be kind of mechanical and technocratic, there are things that the fiscal authority does that have certain political checks and balances on them. And if we believe in those checks and balances and we think that they are useful and appropriate, then what does it mean if you have a central bank that can do the exact same things without those checks and balances? So if you have, if you have a floor system that's allowing you to do an arbitrary amount of QE, including, just buying specific targeted bonds that you want to support or whatever, and doing things that are largely equivalent to things that the fiscal authority would have checks and balances on, you have to ask, do we then want political checks and balances on the Fed? Or are maybe some of the checks and balances that the fiscal authority is subjected to, are those inappropriate to some extent? So I think that's where kind of some of this complexity comes in. And then if you're putting, what he's worried about is if you realize that you need to put checks and balances on the Fed, do you accidentally start putting checks and balances on the things that are working fine and don't need checks and balances on them with respect to monetary policy?
Yeah, I think this is where I think like the political justification of the role of the central bank is likely to change and evolve over time. Because I think in some ways, the central bank is independent as a form of checks and balances over the government, because a technocratic institution is going to be able to provide a long-term view and not necessarily be motivated by the same type of short-term wins of like the political sector. But you can have a view of that and still think, you can have that view, but still think that the checks and balances may be a little bit different. And with that perspective, still allow for more space for something like fiscal QE, if you think that that has, if it's for fulfilling that same type of role, that those types of actions are allowing an escape from political short-termism. I think that is in some ways like some of the justification, like for green finance and et cetera.
Yeah, I think maybe kind of one particular area that it's useful to kind of dig into, because I think this is where a lot of the like rubber hits the road here, is he kind of, I don't know if he's coined this term or not, but he kind of talks about this concept of like fiscal illusion, that when a central bank is using money finance, or even as kind of a consolidated government is using money finance, this makes financing certain policies appear cheaper than it actually is. And I wonder if that's really true. I mean, a potential counter argument is that it is in fact cheaper to finance, much of kind of fiscal policy than is typically the case. But, some people are putting their thumb on the scale by kind of forcing it to be bond financed rather than money financed. I mean, I'm not sure whether that's true or not, but that would be kind of a reasonable counter argument. And I think that that's like a way in which, this treating it as something kind of technical feels a little bit misleading, because then the debate really is, well, is it, could you money finance everything? Does it make a difference if you do or don't? That's one thing that I think he mentions that I do agree with, is that I'm not sure it really matters all that much whether something is money financed or bond financed. I mean, there are differences, but I'm not sure that they are large macroeconomically important differences. Maybe they are, but I'm not sure. And then it kind of it begs this question of whether this something that's kind of purported to be technocratic is in fact being political and using the kind of technical nature or the technical seeming nature of its argument in order to put the thumb on the scale for a certain political conclusion. I mean, he quotes an economist at one point who kind of says, well, kind of money financing makes politicians not have to grapple with difficult questions. And we could sincerely ask, should they be grappling with, like, are those real questions that they should be grappling with? And maybe they are, but I think that argument needs to be made, and he makes some arguments for that in here, which we can also go into a little bit. He argues that fiscal QE would be kind of inflationary. He assumes that the economy is kind of always at full employment or full capacity, and I don't know. I think that they're kind of on the financial aspect of it. Sorry, this is long, but now that I'm thinking about it, I feel like I should complete this thought. On the financial aspect of it, he really kind of at first says, oh, it's not really, there is kind of a financial difference. But in the end, he says the financial difference is because there would be a real resource kind of constraint that results in inflation. And if that's the case, then it doesn't feel financial at all. It feels like a real question, not a real economy question, rather than a financial one. Anyways, sorry, bunch of thoughts.
Yeah, I think I'm with you in that it doesn't seem, it's not apparent to me that there's a significant difference between money finance versus bond finance for the government. And Selgin even points out in the book that if you're paying interest on reserves, if the Fed is paying interest on reserves, then those interest payments are coming out of the profits that would otherwise go to the Treasury. So it's as if the Treasury is paying that interest, and it's as if the reserves are just like a really immediate term, Treasury security or something like that. So the reserves are the Treasury bills if you're paying interest on the reserves. So yeah, I mean, if they're equivalent, then you might think, well, then there's no need to do both. You can say, okay, the fiscal authority can be responsible for that, and you're not going to have the central bank paying interest on reserves. So I think that's part of the argument, and that fits in with the whole do you really want the central bank doing anything that the fiscal authority would normally do and is normally kind of politically constrained?
Yeah, I think this question is really interesting. I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I think that, first of all, from a conceptual perspective, I don't know exactly where he stands intellectually, but of course, libertarians typically view the economy as its own entity outside of the policy, and any politics that enters the economy corrupts it. Kind of, that's sort of the view, and you can sort of see a few hints of that as well in the way we talk about central bank independence and so forth. And I sympathize with it to some degree, but for example, I think the nuance, we're somewhere in the middle, right? There's a nuance here, and I think one observation that we have from Perry is like, what do we actually? The central bank doesn't really gain much from being the primary actor in different markets. It wants to backstop markets. It doesn't want to be the actor, and that's kind of the world we're in. So that's where I sympathize a little bit with the thrust of a lot of these arguments. So the central bank excels at stabilizing. It excels at sort of setting the temperature, but it shouldn't be the person, the actor, being the sole source of finance for the Fed, for the Treasury, or the sole buying up entire markets, and so there's no more other actors really in that sphere. So I think Perry probably has that critique of QE too, and I think we've articulated that in previous we're losing the liquidity backstopping function that the central bank really is there for. And I think if we're thinking about the natural thing, I think that's we're reading stuff that is the art of central banking, or there's an art to it. I think I resist the idea that there's a mechanical thing here, but I accept the idea that there is a specific function that that is independent of political. We want liquidity to be provided no matter the politics, no matter there's a universality to this. I think that's maybe a better term than natural. A universal principle that has to be applied specifically for a certain situation, but it's not going to be the same. I think the fact that you're in a rule-based system really constrains you. I think the question that we have is Tobin right with having his rule-based system in place. I think it might have contributed to the crisis in the end, because we were trying to be too close to that particular framework. But yeah, what I want to say here is simply there is something here in the middle that I think the Money View does provide us an interesting insight with, which is what is the central bank really good at doing historically and also today? I do like the independence of it. I think if there were checks and balances, if there were checks and balances on the Fed, for example, right now putting those swap lines in place to stabilize the world economy, I think we would be in big trouble. I think the Fed is doing exactly the right thing because it's independent, because maybe Congress is not overseeing it. At the same time, this independence also doesn't mean that it has no role to play in all the other questions we're asking here. I think there is something there where we should maybe specify it a bit better. Like, is it backstopping certain markets? If we're saying we're going out and doing stuff, will it be an actor to sort of also be in the market for certain types of debt, for certain securities, to put a floor under it, but not necessarily to being able to hold all of it on its own balance sheet? Those are very different conversations. And these are political conversations, obviously, but it's a very, very different nuance and that's actually somewhere in the middle, right? Where somehow we had Monet on the one hand saying the central bank being a development bank, holding these things potentially when credit allocation, favoring certain sectors. This guy saying no, this is dangerous. And I'm somewhere in the middle of saying, hey, Money View tells us specifically what the central bank is supposed to be doing: floors, outside spread, blah blah blah. And I think we can actually work around these constraints, taking on that there are all politics involved, there are political decisions, and the central bank is not the best actor to be holding all these assets, right? Then we should be spinning off a specific development bank or a public institution that's going to hold these things, that are managing these things, to actually have this set of separation that is actually healthy for us to manage it. But just my personal view here. I'm not sure if you guys agree.
Yeah. Interesting that Selgin. It's interesting that Selgin doesn't really acknowledge the potential macroeconomic benefits of QE when you're not at the zero lower bound. So you could imagine a scenario in which, the central bank is paying interest on reserves, but you still have kind of a liquidity crunch in the asset markets, and you want the Fed to use its balance sheet to backstop those markets, right? This is what Perry talks about all the time. And that's still potentially going to be a useful thing to do, even if you're not at the zero lower bound. You can still have that problem. And I think Selgin is more imagining that the only macroeconomic effect you would want from QE is pushing inflation around to where you want it to be. So you've reached the limit of where you've gone, where you could go with interest rates, and now you need to find some other way to prop up inflation or something like that, or influence the price level. So I think maybe he's missing this other macroeconomic component, which is just the liquidity in the financial markets, which QE could potentially help with anyway.
So I think his argument, though, I mean, he has tried to differentiate throughout the book this business of fiscal QE, i.e. QE that's done to introduce, to influence the allocation of resources and the operational capacity of the government. So I think that's kind of fair enough, but it just seems incredibly circular to say, gotcha, liberals, because you can't make your Green New Deal cheaper with QE because of all these equivalences. Well, the only reason we're talking about it in the first place is because there are some fairly arbitrary constraints on the government's capacity in the present. And some people have identified that one of the things that QE demonstrates is that those are kind of made up. And so he's sort of he's sort of going back against what people have done politically to thread a needle that they shouldn't have to thread in the first place.
Yeah,
So
I think, sorry, again.
So the idea is that there are arbitrary political constraints that are limiting what we could otherwise do, and this is a way of kind of getting around those constraints and showing that maybe those constraints are problematic. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Basically, yeah. It just that seems to be it. I was sort of struck a number of times at the circularity of it. It's just, you can't. He's sort of identifying that this doesn't necessarily change anything in terms of, say, real economy constraints. Like, you might end up overheating the economy this way. I mean, he says, you can't do these things without losing control of inflation and interest rates. And of course, the Fed already doesn't control inflation or every interest rate. So
right.
He's basically saying this will have an effect. Yeah. Okay.
So I guess a question we can ask is, do we want to have a mechanism that lets us get around kind of the rules and regulations that have been established by politics, or do we want to fix those rules and regulations?
Yeah, and I think for me, a big part of it is what is the basis of those constraints? On what basis are we justifying? I mean, for example, kind of a little bit on what we were talking about at the start, I could potentially buy arguments that certain things should be kind of insulated or made more macro, more automatic, fiscal stabilizers, interest rate policy, whatever. You could make arguments, time consistency arguments, whatever they are. And, if people find those compelling, and and I might, then we could, we could have constraints that are not arbitrary in the sense that we have chosen them, kind of consciously. I think my concern is that this way of kind of justifying them under the cover of technical limitations feels like, like it's avoiding that kind of conversation in a way. And so, I could imagine ending up at an institutional arrangement that is not totally dissimilar to what we have now, but on a different basis, one that doesn't claim to be kind of, well, it's technocratic, and so we just can't do anything about it. I think that also one of the kind of questions that envelops this, and he doesn't address it right on head on, but I'm not sure that I fully agree with his argument. And I think it also connects to something that we talk about a lot. But it's this question of like, well, is it always money financed anyways, right? I mean, he says that the MMT people say that, all government finance is ultimately money financed. And, if that's the case, then, these distinctions don't necessarily matter as much as maybe he's kind of making them out to. And he says that it's not the case. He says, and his arguments are, kind of the traditional ones of, well, the central bank, the government is not allowed to borrow kind of directly from the central bank. It's not obligated to, accommodate new bond finance from the government, et cetera, et cetera. I think that this doesn't give the kind of it's always money financed argument full credit for its perspective. My understanding, and I could be wrong, but my understanding of how this argument is often made is, well, when the government issues a bond, that bond doesn't just go to the quote unquote market, but as we kind of often talk about in Perry's class and stuff, it goes to dealers, and the dealers have to finance that. And the big primary dealers and their banks need to finance this issuance, and they finance that in short-term rates that the central bank sets. And as long as the central bank is using the interest rate as its main kind of policy tool, it is in a sense forced to accommodate. Right? I mean, if dealers or the economy or whatever cannot finance the new bonds that are being issued by the government, the interest rate will start to rise and the central bank will be losing control of, the short-term money market rates. And so in order to do that, even in a corridor system, it would need to adjust the level of reserves, right? And so I think that there's an argument that a lot of it is kind of potentially money financed. At minimum, I feel like his argument here is not giving that that perspective. It's making it a bit of a straw man, I think.
Sorry, can we briefly address this taxonomy of reserve management systems, which I just think is really, really strange. So he calls the current system a floor system, but it's very clearly a corridor system. There's a borrow rate and a lending rate, and you never get outside of it in the actual object of policy control, which he says is the IOER now, but that's not really true. Like it's the overnight rate. That's the object of policy control, and the Fed's effectively saying,
the repo rate is the real floor. Is that what you're getting at?
No, not at all. I'm saying that I'm drawing a distinction between whatever rates the central bank happens to be using at the time, which changes like every few years because they're always changing this. All central banks, shift the way they do reserve management. The true, if you're doing rate setting, you're trying to affect the overnight rate, the overnight risk-free rate, and whether that's done via having an IOER or having a borrow rate and a lending rate, or as some central banks do, a Lombard rate even, it's not very important. He attaches this this importance to the change to IOER that it absolutely, in my view, doesn't deserve. I mean, I'm speaking as a money market guy here. It doesn't really change. It's really not a big shift, and it's also historically not that much of a variation. Banks have always had these corridor rates where they borrow and lend, and sometimes they have zero reserves. It's just
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go on.
I think sometimes there's a little bit of unfortunate language about some of this stuff too, right? I mean, it's very clearly kind of designed to create a corridor of interest rates. But I think that the way that the terminology often gets used is that a quote unquote corridor system is one where the interest rate kind of trades materially between these bands, in part due to a scarcity of reserves, a constructed scarcity, but a scarcity nonetheless. While I think the floor, the kind of floor terminology, there's still, as you point out, an actual kind of corridor of interest rates, but that the interest rate is floored at the bottom of the corridor because there's this kind of abundance or superabundance of reserves in the interbank market. I take your point that how these, from a technical and money markets perspective, it may not be all that, important or interesting which one you use. And that's more or less my opinion as well. I think that for him, it is important because one lends itself to political temptation. Of course, the argument could be that the other avoids a political conversation. So, it's interesting. I don't know, the way that these kind of technical things can, then be kind of brought into a more, I don't know, macro or philosophical kind of conversation.
But it ignores the reality of how excess reserves came about this time, which was that basically, as he says, and he even acknowledges it, like they got to 2008, they needed TARP, so they just did it. There was no conversation. So it's strange.
Yeah. Well, and I want to be clear. I think Seljan agrees that from a money market perspective, it doesn't matter whether you're using kind of reserve management to set your overnight rate or to target your overnight rate, or you're paying interest on excess reserves to target your overnight rate. It doesn't matter for the money market. What it matters for is this other thing that he cares about, which is that if you're using the interest on reserves to manage your target overnight rate, then that allows the central bank to potentially do whatever it wants with QE. They can buy whatever assets they want, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't see how that's different to any other time, to be honest. They always have this, the debate is, do we do asset purchases or not? And if you do asset purchases, you will probably end up having to manage your reserves differently. It just seems.
So the question is, if you ban interest on excess reserves or something like that, then that'll force you to manage reserves to get your target rate, and it doesn't allow you as much leeway with QE, right?
Sure. So
and in some ways, it feels like that's just like in some ways, it feels like that's a little bit less of a transparent or less of a transparent kind of question, right? You're just moving the question around to a space that it feels potentially less transparent.
Yeah, I think if you ask most people, you know, because you can frame the question like this, and this is how I have seen it framed politically a lot, and including by here, I think somewhere in the book he frames it like this. It's basically, well, you know, is it right that we're going to just pay the banks all this interest? That's how the question ends up being framed. And you know, one debate that's taking place amongst market participants at the moment, especially in the UK, is that there's this idea that at 1.25%, roughly, people smarter than me have calculated, the UK, the Bank of England will end up losing money on the QE book. And so it's starting to have the Treasury remit it funds every month, and that will become a big political concern. And so there's a preponderance of bets that basically put the terminal rate at 1.25 for that reason.
Yeah, I think that also brings up another very interesting question that comes up in the book in this section, which is, you know, he then kind of asks, you know, well, does it matter if the central bank loses money? And you know, there are some kind of technical questions about, you know, the accounting of these things and, you know, where it ends up and this kind of thing. But then, you know, there's this question of like, basically, does like central bank capital matter? And he, you know, points out that central banks have operated with, you know, zero or negative equity without, you know, many problems. Well, I don't know if you'd say without many problems. My understanding is that, you know, some have operated without, you know, many problems, such as in Chile or the Czech Republic with negative capital. There's, you know, I think this question of like, is there an economic way in which it matters, or is it, you know, kind of just a political concern, which is kind of what Ben was referring to, that, you know, once a central bank starts losing money, then, you know, that starts getting bad headlines in Congress or, you know, Parliament or whatever, kind of drags them in and, you know, maybe takes away their independence. And that seems to be the main argument. There's another question whether it matters kind of economically, right? Whether, you know, whether a central bank operating with negative equity is, you know, going to get into some kind of trouble. And, you know, there are economic arguments made that would be the case. I'm not sure I find them super compelling, but in this kind of question about like, you know, does it matter if the central bank is losing money? I mean, and, you know, I think this is important because, you know, then we have this kind of, if it is, then we have this automatic tension between, you know, what should a central bank do in terms of kind of maximizing economic welfare or its own profits, which seems not like it should be the primary objective of public policy. But, you know, if there's a good economic technical argument, you know, maybe that's the case. I don't know. What did y'all think about this kind of conversation?
Yeah. So I think if you have a fiscal authority who can do all the deficit stuff on their side, and you can have all your checks and balances there, then it feels redundant to also allow the central bank to do it, unless you're really trying to get around like bad policy or something like that, and you're trying to like cheat something.
Any other thoughts on this? I mean, for me, I I have kind of always been under the impression or of the opinion that central banks should not, be concerned with their own kind of financial welfare, because I don't think there's a strong economic argument for it. There may be a political one, and I know there's some research, for example, that shows that central banks are particularly sensitive about policies that could potentially end up resulting in major losses. But my opinion, generally has been that central banks should operate in order to kind of get the optimal outcome for the economy as a whole, and that in some way the benefits to the rest of the economy are the underlying foundation of the central bank's true economic power, as opposed to its kind of financial or accounting accounting, I don't know, entries.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like it was 100 years of evolution to get to that conclusion, in a way, for central banks to assume that responsibility and recognize that they act for the common good instead of operating for themselves. But on the question of, I guess, for me, it's not clear like the economic constraints. I think like the fact that there are political constraints around that what that may mean are clear. I mean, a lot of people would also argue against QE because of like the potential losses and like risk that the central bank was taking. However, in my mind, it's not clear one way or the other, like what the economic consequences or constraints might be.
Yeah, I think the way I like to think about it is that the economic constraints constrain our institutions collectively as a whole. And then it's up to us to kind of decide what we want each institution to be responsible for within those overall constraints. So then you kind of politically allocate responsibilities within the economic constraints. So it's not that a central bank per se is ultimately facing the economic constraints. It's that the whole system is, and you want to decide what the central bank's role should be, kind of.
Yeah, I think also there's this, and he kind of mentions this several times throughout the book. I mean, there's this kind of sense or assumption throughout the text that we will kind of always be in a place of optimal policy, and that the economy will kind of always be running at full capacity, and therefore it feels like a lot of the arguments that he makes are arguments that one could level against fiscal policy generally, and not specifically whether it's kind of financed through quantitative easing. And so I think that part of that, I think, and now I'm speculating, so I don't want to put words in Drew Selgin's mouth, but I'm speculating that in part that comes from a belief that monetary policy is very powerful and can manage to keep the economy at full capacity all the time if operated well. And I think that during the financial crisis, and and I would say more generally in history, my sense is that that's not always the case. I mean, there's the Keynes quote that I don't remember exactly what it is, but basically if the central bank is, I don't know, it's something like providing liquidity, and the economy is drinking from the cup of liquidity from the central bank, that there is a lot of slippage from cup to mouth. And so I think my view is that monetary policy can be very powerful, but that it's really not the kind of thing that can easily keep the economy at kind of full capacity all the time. And if that's the case, and if we are, kind of often in cases, more often in the case where there's a lot of kind of spare capacity in the economy, then, the role of fiscal policy is kind of much easier to justify. And so, all of that is to say, I think that trying to understand the book from his perspective, it's really kind of important to, you know, understand these assumptions, and then when we kind of are evaluating here, to think about to what extent, you know, that's something that kind of we find more or less compelling, you know.
Didn't your lot at the Bank of England do quite a nice paper recently that they put on Bank Underground? Yeah, I just found it. They basically found that, yeah, having had additional reserves from QE did nothing to banks' actual lending. There was no difference between the QE receiving banks and the control group.
I didn't see that.
Yeah, it's quite a recent.
I should probably read
one.
more about
I've been spamming it.
Yeah, maybe could you, if you've got it in front of you, could you put the link in the chat? I'll take a look.
Find it. I haven't used Zoom in a while, amazingly enough. We use Teams for everything.
I think another thing that's kind of interesting about this is, you know, there's a lot of question about whether QE works at all, right? I mean, you know, there are a lot of arguments, you know, a lot of people who will basically say that, you know, most of the power of QE outside of particular kind of financial market disruption is, you know, more or less for signaling short rate policy. And, you know, I think that ends up kind of making a big difference when you kind of come down on some of these questions too. You know, for example, would kind of fiscal QE, as he kind of explains it, would it necessarily make a difference? I mean, would it matter a lot? And I think that that's kind of an open question, and maybe depends a lot on, you know, the specific form in which it takes. Yeah.
Well, I think it's important to pay attention to the fact that Selgin is not talking about fiscal QE changing the way banks lend. He's talking about fiscal QE, you know, being the central bank lending kind of element once, and that's where kind of the problem stems from.
Like buying green bonds or something like that, right? But I think even then,
exactly.
there are real questions about how much that may matter or not. I mean, you know, this is a theme that I mentioned from time to time, but there's kind of a real tension between the economic and financial perspectives here, right? I mean, in economics, like supply and demand matter a lot, and the quantity of what is going on in any kind of transaction or whatever is very important. But in finance, that is not really the case. And in kind of standard financial models, quantity is more or less irrelevant. I mean, in a very simplified, you know, perspective, which of course there are real limitations to, but the kind of simplified perspective is that, well, you know, something, you know, a financial asset is priced based on its kind of fundamental value, and, you know, it doesn't matter how much more or less there is of it. And maybe that's true, maybe it's not. But, you know, I think that there are many people that argue that, you know, for example, quantitative easing does not drive down the prices of long-term bonds. And so it's not clear that, you know, quantitative easing would, you know, on green bonds would necessarily cause their prices to be improved. I mean, there are other things that central banks could do, and this is where I think Eric Monet's book is interesting, right? I mean, what rate that central banks allow them to be used as collateral in refinancing operations, discount windows, et cetera, I think could in fact be very powerful. But those are not, you know, outright purchases and these kinds of things. They're very different ways in which the central bank, you know, could be involved in different parts of the economy.
Yeah, that's kind of where I landed, because I was in some of a similar camp to Jay, that I think I was compelled by the arguments for the corridor system, not compelled at all with his arguments against fiscal QE, but had questions around, would fiscal QE actually be the most effective means for these different political goals within society? And I think that's like where the question is, like, what would, because I agree with you that Monet's like the most compelling examples like was what it was able to do to grow long-term bond markets in France. So that was quite important, and it was important for the history of development in France. So like, are there things like that that could be interesting for there to be a role? And again, there's a question of, should it be the central bank or should it be development bank? What institution within society should be playing that role? But I think that to me is like the more interesting question.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, you know, as I understand it, you know, the ECB's purchase of, you know, certain securitized bonds after the global financial crisis was in part an effort to kind of grow that market. I'm not sure, you know, how much that has worked, but like, you know, that was kind of an explicit objective. I think also one place that you see that here is his conversation about the kind of interbank market, right? Where he, you know, argues that by using a certain operating framework, you know, either encourage or discourage the development of interbank lending. And he makes some arguments for, you know, why those might be good things, you know, or interbank lending, you know, could be a good thing. Some of them, you know, are more or less compelling, I think, in my opinion. One that I kind of one that I think, and this is always the case with it, well, not always, this is often the case with a lot of economic stuff, one that sounds very interesting and compelling. Upon further reflection, I didn't know how much I really agreed with, which is this idea that like interbank market lending encourages kind of self-monitoring among banks. And he points out some older papers that show that this is the case, and I need to go read them and see, you know, if they make a better argument. But at a macro level, you know, when I kind of step back and thinking about it, and you're like, well, you know, I mean, the lead up to the global financial crisis, banks were, you know, increasingly using, you know, shorter and shorter term funding, less and less capital. And you would imagine that if monitoring was playing an important role, their cost of financing would go up. We would see LIBOR OIS spreads, you know, widening, and we didn't. And so, you know, from a macro level, I'm, you know, having an interbank market may or may not be good for other reasons, but I'm not sure that I find this reason particularly compelling, because it's hard to square it with the evidence, at least at the macro level. The other thing that I would say is, you know, I think there are other kinds of theories about how banking work that, you know, are in tension to this. Yeah.
Can we pause on that one? Because on whether or not like there was self-monitoring, because my understanding is that people kind of had their bets on who was going to fall next. And I think that signals that there's some level of monitoring happening. Like it may not necessarily be expressed because you think of the backstops, et cetera. There are reasons for that. Agreed.
So like when the crisis occurs, you know, all of a sudden there's a lot of dispersion in interbank rates, and in general, in aggregate, they go up, right? I guess my question is, does it help? Was that the case sufficiently in advance that this was useful information? And it can be useful in a couple of ways. It could be useful in a form of self-disciplining, where, you know, reckless banks, you know, have a higher cost of funds and therefore, you know, feel incentivized to get their house in order. I think it's hard to make the argument that that's the case because they kind of blew up anyways. You know, another way it could be useful is that it's kind of expressed in the aggregate, and it's something that policymakers could monitor. But I don't think you could see it in the aggregate, you know, in the lead up to the crisis. So, you know, banks' financial positions deteriorated for many years before the financial crisis, and you know, I think that I don't know, it's hard for me to find that as kind of compelling. Yeah.
But I think it's the reasons around. I think there's like competitive dimensions that I think are sometimes underappreciated in our theory. I think the problem is a bank that is already in a position where it's been reckless. If it is increasing its cost of funding, that will tend to increase the chances that it's taking more risks rather than less. So actually, that has like an amplifying effect that is different.
Right. There's also a distinction between the riskiness, the relative riskiness of individual banks versus kind of the risk of the system as a whole.
Exactly. And I think one
yeah.
feeds to the other. It's kind of the very Minskian thing that because banks are competing with each other for their clients, one bank being riskier increases the pressure on other banks to take more risk as well.
Yeah, I think this is, this is something that comes up a lot, I think, in very old history on banks. And there's some banking theory around this too, where when banks competed by offering higher interest rates, a bad bank that is having difficulty attracting funds will need to offer a higher interest rate to do so. And that will, then bring in kind of more funds, right? And so it potentially has this kind of, instead of a disciplining effect, which I think is, the way that I understood Selgin is making the argument, that would be the opposite of the kind of like disciplining argument. There's also, and I still think we should read a book by him at some point. There's this kind of theory and perspective on banking that focuses on opacity that's very large, a large literature coming from Gary Gorton, where he kind of argues that banks are in a way designed to be kind of unmonitorable, or maybe not completely, but in part. And if that's the case, then again, this kind of self-monitoring discipline is potentially something that may not work out as well, as some theories might suggest. So yeah, I think these are kind of interesting alternative arguments, and they lead to this question of like whether that's a good thing that we really want to encourage.
Just on that, he's making the argument explicitly that it's good to have what I would call a required reserve system as opposed to an excess reserve system, because it forces banks to go in the interbank, and that's how you get the disciplining effect. But he's talking about the overnight market, and like, that's not true of the overnight market. The overnight market is not a credit market. It's just either it works or it doesn't. You don't get any disciplining effect from like, okay, today I lend to Barclays at 10 bips. Oh, but tomorrow I just don't lend to them at all because they've gone bust now. What is the disciplining effect of that? The disciplining effect in theory would come from term lending. And there is still tons of term lending. It's just done in the commercial paper market.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if I'm trying to be charitable to his argument, I guess that his idea would be that if you became concerned with the bank, that you might not lend to it at a short term, and so it needs to go fund itself in the term markets. That is more costly, and so this extra cost has made the bank decide that in the future it will be more responsible and get its house in order.
Or you'd increase the overnight rate at which you're willing to lend as well. That's part of it too, right?
Yeah, isn't there like a moment in Perry's class where he talks about like people thought that the unsecured interbank market had a different rate than the overnight secured, and they thought it's like, oh, it's because of the credit component, and it actually may not be the credit component, it's just the liquidity component. Because I think Ben's argument, it's like there's no disciplining really, and overnight is essentially like I think it's sensible.
Something else that's interesting related, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to just say that I like that we went in this because I'm compelled by having an interbank market just from everything that we've talked about in Perry's class. But I agree that this is the least compelling reason for it. So like, what is it that you get? I think you get like an active dealer market. You're supplying the discipline for the banks themselves, like to manage like their profits, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's self-disciplining across the banks.
Yeah, I mean, I think the high level argument, as I understand it, is that, the unsecured bank lending market in theory operates, on the basis of kind of credit worthiness, while the secured, interbank market doesn't, because it uses collateral kind of in place of credit. I think whether, Ben is kind of suggesting that maybe that's not really the right way to think about it. And, it's not really ever kind of about credit. An alternative way to think about it is that, and I think this is kind of the Gary Gorton perspective, is that it's only about credit when the crisis occurs. And, that like, basically, kind of credit risk doesn't get priced until liquidity disappears or something. I don't know. I mean, I wonder how important it is to have an interbank market, and to what extent, or an unsecured interbank market, and to what extent there are arguments for it that are kind of beyond the disciplining aspect of it, because that part seems less compelling to me.
Something I didn't understand that Selgin said was that he was hoping that by reviving the corridor system, it would also bring back the unsecured interbank overnight market. And my question is, why wouldn't everybody just stick with the repo market for, as their source of overnight money market funds? It wasn't clear to me why it would automatically bring back the debt funds market.
I think if you also force a structure where banks are also managing scarce reserves for themselves, they need to lend and borrow those reserves amongst each other.
But why aren't they doing it in the repo market?
It's true.
I mean, I guess, a question would be the extent to which they want or need, or there are additional costs to like having and managing collateral. So kind of an unsecured interbank market in principle, might be less costly if you think that, maintaining the collateral that you need in order to manage reserves, it incurs additional costs that are problematic for you.
Yeah, because wasn't the interbank market actually already losing ground to repo market before the crisis? Like the unsecured.
Question. I think that that's the case, and I probably should know the answer, but I don't. Ben might know the answer if we haven't lost him.
So one thing I also want to get back to was when you were talking about everything being money funding and what that means. And I was thinking another way to think about it is it could depend on where you draw the line between what's money and what's not, like what's money versus what's credit. Like if you think of a treasury security as just another kind of money because it's a close money substitute, then bond financing is also a form of money financing just on its own. So you can think of, I'm sorry about the noise. Something you can think about is, so the treasury issues a treasury security, and that's the issuance of money, right? And then it's just up to the central bank to decide what form they want that money to take. So maybe it's reserves, maybe they do an operation twist and swap some long-term securities for some short-term securities or something like that. But it's really the fiscal authority that's issuing the money. Everything's money financed, and the central bank is just deciding, what the composition of that is. And that would be the same even if the fiscal authority could issue reserves directly and spend reserves, because then the central bank would still have to do their monetary policy, and maybe they issue, something that would be the equivalent of a treasury bill or a treasury bond or something, but it would be a Fed bill or a Fed bond. You'd still have to end up having kind of a similar situation. You know what I mean? So there you can think of like there's an equivalence there between bond financing and money financing. That doesn't have to look at anything else really.
Yeah, one really interesting aspect of the last part of that thought, I think, is that it comes back to what Larissa was saying earlier about what the whether there might be some function in terms of fiscal QE. And I think what you were implying, Larissa, is that there's a kind of asset liability mismatch in the economy. We need to do this green financing, and maybe that's the way to do it because we need to get a sort of longer term market in green debt instruments going. And to be honest, like the history of central banking is kind of a history of that needing to build state capacity, right? We have central banks. We had a central bank in the UK because we needed to mobilize a lot of government resources to do big wars. And that was just part of it. You needed to effectively make sure that, there was still, the domestic economy was still relatively balanced. You didn't have too much gold outflows, all that kind of thing. And the capacity grew around that. So, as you were saying, what happens then is that in a situation where the central bank only does, where the government does monetary issuance instead of the central bank, then the central bank has to do asset and liability policy for the government. And to be fair, in modern central banking, we've kind of started to do that. Like in Japan, they do yield curve control because they realized that that was a thing they needed to do. Well, and you can argue if they're right, but they thought they needed to.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, this is something we've come across in a lot of books, which is, the way in which money in general is a way to kind of mobilize resources, right? I mean, even the kind of early coinage in order to pay their tribute to the Danes or whatever, in England was kind of a way of trying to mobilize economic resources through a kind of monetary system. I do think that, and one thing that I am sympathetic to, and in some ways I kind of suspect that, and again, I'm not an expert on MMT or anything, so I could be getting this wrong, but I think that a lot of the MMT people would say, in some sense, George Selgin's argument about the political, legitimacy, that many of these questions should be answered kind of politically. I think they would say yes, but like everything should be, right, including kind of monetary policy in general. Yeah, I think. Yeah, I think there's kind of two dimensions of that, right? There's this kind of the role, like in abstract, the role of money in kind of facilitating resource management in the economy writ large, and a second part of it, which is like the particular kind of institutional form and kind of allocation of tasks in that. Yeah. Do people have any other thoughts on this question, or should we? I mean, we're running a little low on time here. Are there kind of other last questions or ideas that people want to make sure that they get in before we wrap up? Nope. All right.
I'm good.
Cool. So we'll wrap it up. I think that we're going to take a little bit of a longer break this time, right? Because there's the Money View Symposium over the weekend, or over next weekend. And then we're going to start reading, or for some of us, rereading the new Lombard Street, which I haven't read since basically it came out. So, it's a good time to go back and reread it. I think that'll be a good one to do. Yeah. So wrap it up for there. And yeah.